Good morning, Heritage. It's Brock Paul coming to you from the lobby of our church campus here at Heritage Church of Christ. And we, for a number of months, have been working towards trying to get the team and the equipment and all of the systems set up so that we could deliver video recorded versions of sermons to you through the web. But we've kind of had to accelerate that process because of current world events. And so you're going to get to see our dress rehearsal today. This is our first time to have a video recorded sermon, and we're excited to share it with you and to be able to continue in the message series that we started 2 weeks ago. Earlier this month, we started this series called Plugged In, and the concept of the messages is all about staying connected to the power of God. Little did we know, of course, that as we began this series, this week was going to find us facing a type of disconnection that is extremely unusual for us. Our schools are closed and lots of our workers are being forced to work from home. Some of the typical events that we're accustomed to seeing during this time of the year, things like March Madness and baseball spring training, they've been canceled. It's all highly unusual. But one of the constants that we usually count on every week is the opportunity to gather together for worship. I miss being together with you in the same place for our church services this week. I miss gathering for small groups and Bible classes and studies together. I miss the conversation and the visiting that's usually happening in this very room. But life has really been disrupted. You may remember that last week when we started Daylight Saving Time, I gave you pastor's orders to go home in the afternoon and turn on some golf on TV and take a nap. This weekend you can't even do that because the PGA canceled all of their events. So much of our lives have been impacted by this sudden detachment from things that last week we didn't even know we felt that connected to. And disconnection like this is disruptive. For many of us, our weekly church gathering is one of the most consistent, dependable facets of our connection with God during the week. But in a week like this, it becomes all that much more important for each of us to have meaningful and personal pathways to connection with God, channels to connect with God that we're committed to on our own, that are separate from this weekly in-person congregational gathering. Now, last week I introduced to you the importance of having a regular rhythm of spiritual exercise in your life, a consistent practice of connecting to God that builds spiritual muscle and gives your spiritual life depth and meaning. And this week, we all have a unique opportunity to start utilizing or begin practicing some of those exercises because our schedules have been so completely rearranged. Many of us are going to have time at home this week, time by ourselves that we didn't have last week. For some of us, we may have kids at home that are home from school, and we're going to have some unplanned free time that gives us an opportunity to implement some family spiritual practices that maybe we've been considering or things that have been on our mind for a while. This disruption to our normal routines might just provide the perfect opportunity that you need to jumpstart a new spiritual practice. But we've also been given some unique reasons this week to use spiritual muscles. Some of us have been struck by some fear this week. Maybe you've been worried about your health. Maybe you've been worried about the health of people you love. I know some people in our church who have been wrestling with anger and resentment. Maybe you've come to believe that this is all an overreaction and a big inconvenience and making much ado about nothing, and maybe that's been really frustrating for you. I know there are others in our church who have been thrust into the unknown with their job and their income. Maybe their job's been lost or threatened because of the impact that this global health event has had on the economy. This has been a week when your patience, your faith, or your peace may have been significantly tested. And so with that opportunity, that time that we've got on our hands, and with all of those reasons for concern in mind, I want to talk to you this morning about a foundational spiritual practice that each and every one of us can begin utilizing starting today, and it's the practice of listening for the words of God. There's a song that was written about 3,000 years ago by a man in Israel who had built strong spiritual muscles in his own life. His name was David, and one of the many songs that he wrote has been preserved and passed down to us, and we know it is Psalm 19. It starts like this. It says, "The heavens proclaim the glory of God, and the skies display God's craftsmanship. Day after day, the heavens and the skies continue to speak, and night after night they make him known. They speak without a sound or a word. Their voice is never heard, and yet their message has gone throughout the earth, and their words to all of the world. In that introduction, David is celebrating the way that creation points to the power and the existence of God. For David, it was obvious. The sun, the moon, and the stars, these heavenly bodies, are all testifying with clockwork regularity about a creator who put them in place and gave them their assignments. David says these heavenly bodies are faithfully speaking, even though they aren't making any noise. Their message is transmitted everywhere. All of humanity experiences and witnesses what they're saying about God. The entire earth experiences those daily reminders. And if David was correct, then it means that the heavens are still speaking. Day after day, night after night. It means that the creation still has something to say about the glory and the craftsmanship and the identity of the Creator. But you and I both know that it's incredibly easy to overlook the significance, to forget about the splendor of those clockwork rhythms that happen in the skies right above our heads. It's so easy to forget that God is speaking to humanity through creation. But that's not the only way God communicates to us. David goes on to say a little bit more about that later in the song. He says, "The instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commandments of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living." And David goes on and on in this song about how the commands of the Lord are true and fair. And when you read this section of the song, you get the idea that David was extremely grateful and he was amazed at the way that God had communicated verbally with humanity in the past. Now, David didn't have a Bible like you and I do. In fact, David's life happened really early in the timeline of the Bible, and so most of the Bible's stories and contents hadn't even happened and definitely hadn't been written down yet. But David knew about God's interaction with people in history like Abraham and Sarah, Jacob and Joseph, Moses and Joshua. He knew the laws and the commandments that God had given to the Israelites for their good and so that they'd be a holy nation. And David he appreciated the law of God because it provided boundaries and directions and instruction. Like the white lines that mark the sides of our highways, God's law provided a warning for those who thought to cross it and a reward for those who followed it through. And so for David, the words that God handed down, those that he handed down to Moses, were reliable for building your life upon. But something incredible happened. Long after Moses received God's law, and even longer after David wrote this song, and the incredible thing is that God kept on communicating to humanity. In fact, if you jump ahead a few centuries, past the time of the rise and fall of Israel and past the time of all the prophets who spoke for God in the rest of the Old Testament, if you skip ahead into the time period of the Roman Empire, there's a book written by an unknown author, and it's very near the end of your Bible. It's called Hebrews, and it starts out with this recap that says, "Long ago, God spoke many times and in many ways to our ancestors through the prophets." And then in the next verse, it says something new has occurred. It says, "And now, in these final days, God has spoken to us through his Son." Now these verses, these first two verses of Hebrews, they're a reminder that God has been communicating with humanity for a long, long time. There's been communication through the wonders of creation. There's been direct communication through the laws and instructions that God gave to Israel through Moses. There's been communication through prophet after prophet who shared a word that they were directly given from God. And then there was direct communication through Jesus, who was God in the flesh. But there was even more communication that kept coming after that. And the rest of the New Testament is full of the testimonies and the stories of messengers who were listening to God and sharing what they'd heard. There were apostles and preachers and prophets and missionaries and scholars who all continued to share the words of God for the people of God. In fact, since the very beginning, God has been communicating and keeps on communicating with humanity. But here's the thing. It's up to each one of us to listen. And listening for the words of God is a spiritual discipline that takes focus and intention and practice. It requires intentionality to quiet all of the distractions and quiet the noise and quiet yourself so that you can listen for the words of God. It's a habit that takes time and practice, but there is a consistent message, a consistent testimony from generation after generation of believers promising that the way to life and the way to peace and the way to patience and the way to self-control comes from listening for the words that God is speaking to you. Now, you're being bombarded by messages, especially right now. In fact, if you're anything like me, your phone is probably pinging multiple times an hour with new news reports, and so your social media timelines are riddled with opinions and articles from every which direction. We are surrounded by messengers. And when things in our lives feel uncertain or scary or unfair and everything else around us is incredibly loud, it is so easy to get sucked into the echo chamber of headlines and hot takes. But in the midst of all of that, God is still speaking to you. God is still communicating with humanity. And the way to keep from being wrecked by the latest threat or the most recent rumor is in learning to listen more closely to what God is saying to you. That's the foundation of faith. It's the truth that has been handed down to us by generations who watched the goodness of God in creation, who experienced the blessing of living according to God's instruction, who saw prophecies come true, and who witnessed Jesus' life and death and then life again. We've got to get in the habit of listening personally and collectively for the words of God. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use this unusual season to practice together listening for the words of God. And here at Heritage, we're going to offer some specific spiritual resources for you, things that you can use to deepen your own connection to God. We're going to share playlists of music with songs that can direct your heart in worship and direct your attention to God, even when we can't gather to sing together in our auditorium. We're going to be sharing video messages from Miss Amy and Mr. Marty and different people in our leadership, things that you can share even with kids, some children's ministry focused videos that are kid friendly and will help the kids learn and start a spiritual conversation with them. We're going to open up discussions on our Heritage Church Online Facebook page, and we're going to connect with each other and share what God is teaching us during this unusual time. We're going to make you aware of Bible reading plans and video Bible studies that can jumpstart or refresh your own study habits and provide guidance and insight for you as you learn. In fact, in an effort to do some of this together, I'm going to lead an online Bible study this week on the Heritage Church Online Facebook page, and I'll be posting the first assignment later today so that you can join in on the discussion with us. Before we wrap up, I want to offer you some hope. Listen, if you're feeling anxiety or grief or anger over the situation that is encompassing all of us right now, you're not alone, and you're not being unfaithful for feeling those things. And God's not scared of those emotions. He asks us to invite Him into those moments of uncertainty and to wrestle with our own desire for control. And so we're going to continue to listen for what God has to say. We're going to continue to lean on the promises that God has for us. We're going to continue to trust that God really does know, really does care, really does see our situation and loves us dearly. And we're going to continue to support one another. I hope that as you begin to practice these skills and begin to utilize some of these new practices and exercises in your own spiritual life, that you are going to consistently and increasingly feel more and more plugged in to the power of God. May God bless your week, bless your time, and bless you as we face this week together.